So it's no secret that us grimdarkers love our enamel paints and washes. The use of streak and grime has become pretty synonymous with painting in the grimdark style, so much so that it's actually getting pretty hard to find a grimdark paint job that doesn't involve the use of some of these products. Now, I've seen some people coming up with some pretty inventive ways of using these products, but the one that I'm asked the most questions about is using this, an airbrush. An airbrush can be an incredible tool for painting in general, but when using products like streak and grime, it can actually be a bit of a game changer. When doing techniques like reductive painting, applying the enamels with an airbrush can not only give you a much more even coating than a brush, but also does tend to give a bit of a different finish as well. A lot of people do, however, have reservations about using enamels through an airbrush though, and to be honest, I can completely understand this. Whilst there are plenty of videos that will teach you how to set up, use and clean an airbrush when using acrylic paints, there is a big lack of knowledge when it comes to enamels. Using enamels through an airbrush is nothing new though. Scale modelers have been doing it for years and the information is out there, you've just got to search for it. Well, today I'm going to try and save you some time and effort, and I'm going to answer my most frequently asked questions when it comes to using enamels through an airbrush. Now, before we get to the fun part of actually firing some stuff through this thing, we do need to do the boring part. Safety. As you may be aware, enamel paints are unlike acrylics in that they use an oil or a solvent as a base. Whilst this provides the enamels with a much glossier and tougher wear and finish, it does also mean that they are quite a bit more dangerous for us hobbyists. And if you're using them through an airbrush, you're essentially atomizing these potentially toxic particles into the air that you're breathing. Regardless of the paint, it's always important to do your airbrushing in a well ventilated area. But this is especially important when it comes to enamels. So you must do all you can to ensure that you have a good airflow around you to get rid of all those potentially toxic paint particles floating around in the air. By spraying near an open window and with multiple fans to move the air, I can start to limit the concentration of these particles floating around me. Whilst this isn't ideal, this can go a very long way into making the area safer. The easiest and probably the most important way of making this process safer though, is through the use of a respirator. If you've watched my previous tutorials, you will no doubt have seen me grabbing out the respirator anytime the enamels come out. Whilst it is best practice to use one of these when airbrushing with any paint, personally I feel that when it comes to enamels, this becomes a necessity rather than just preferred. A respirator that is rated for paint particles can help to filter out the majority of the toxic particles you are spraying into the air, and this will make the whole process considerably safer. Yes, they aren't the most comfortable and can cause you to get all a bit warm, especially in the middle of the summer, but these masks will prevent you from getting lightheaded and hopefully prevent any future health issues. Surprisingly, the prepping of these paints for use actually requires very little effort. If you're working with a streak and grime or any of the AK Interactive or ammo washes, then these actually require very little thinning. When using one of the thinner consistency products like the Paneliner or one of the washes, then these can actually be used straight through the airbrush without being thinned. You will, however, have to build these up slowly in thin layers. If you apply too much at one time, it can act very similar to when you apply too much wash or contrast paint using a brush and give you some strange pooling and watermarks. If you're using one of the various streak and grime products, then I advise that you do thin this ever so slightly using an enamel thinner such as this Odorless thinner made by AK Interactive. You can use standard white spirit or turpentine for this, but I've generally found that when thinning my paints, the artist grade thinners such as these do provide a better result and they don't smell nearly as bad. There are a lot of products on the market that are just as good as this AK Interactive thinner, and I will be honest, many of them are definitely cheaper, but this one was very easy for me to just drop in the cart while doing an order with Firestorm Games, and I'm definitely one for convenience. Now, to spray enamels, you basically treat them just like any other paint. Trigger control is very important, and just like if you were spraying acrylics, you are much better served to take your time and just to slowly build up thin layers until you get to your desired effect. Now, I've often been asked about what PSI to use when using enamels, and like when spraying with acrylics, this is very much a case of balancing the PSI and the consistency of the paint. Generally, for the thinner paints, you'll want to be using a lower pressure. With my compressor, I tend to sit somewhere around 15 to 20 psi. For the thicker paints, such as a streak and grime, you'll want to be using a higher PSI, generally, again, somewhere in the range of about 30 psi for myself, and this is to prevent the paint from drying within the nozzle and blocking it. Now, some of this is a little dependent on the equipment that you are using, but this should give you a pretty good baseline and somewhere to start from. Now, aside from the safety aspects, cleaning is probably the biggest concern that people have when using enamels through their airbrushes. As mentioned earlier, when enamel paints dry, they dry tough and hard wearing. This is great for your miniatures, but it's definitely not great for your airbrush. Because of this, it's really important to make sure that you don't allow these enamel paints to dry within the brush, and to achieve this, you need to give your airbrush a very thorough cleaning straight after use. For this, I'll do a full strip down clean on the brush, using white spirits with cotton buds and some airbrush cleaning brushes to remove any dried paint inside the brush. Using these brushes, I will clean until they are no longer pulling out any dried paint. I have seen people recommending using standard airbrush cleaning fluid for this job, but in my experience it doesn't work, or at least nowhere near good enough to ensure the smooth running of your airbrush. Airbrush cleaners are generally water based, and unlike the white spirits, they won't break down those enamel paints if you've allowed them to dry inside the brush. With careful application of white spirit, you can easily clear out these enamels without damaging the airbrush itself. Personally, I would stick to this method of cleaning rather than bathing the brush in white spirit or turpentine. I've seen others doing this recently, and I would very much not advise this, as using such aggressive chemicals on the rubber seals of the airbrush is definitely not ideal, and these seals are delicate and fairly expensive to replace when they perish. So then guys, these are my top tips for using enamel paints through an airbrush, but if you have any other questions, pop them down in the comments below and I will attempt to answer every single one. Alternatively, please feel free to head over to our Discord server, which I'll link down in the description below. Over there we often have discussions about various techniques, and we do have a section where you can ask any questions you want. If you've enjoyed this video, then please hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. I do have a number of tutorials planned over the near future, covering a pretty wide range of different techniques. So thanks for watching guys, and remember, if all else fails, spray it black and start again.